Could a single moment of desperation truly be the end of the road, when the world outside dissolves into a deafening roar, and the cold seeps into your very bones? It's easy to believe that you've reached the final chapter. The howling wind was 1,000 voices screaming into the night. Inside the small cave, carved imperfectly into the unforgiving mountain rock, Margaret pulled her children closer. Their small bodies, Clara and Henry, trembled against hers, a fragile shield against the plummeting temperature. Clara's face was pale, her lips taking on an alarming shade of blue that Margaret had only ever seen in movies. 5-year-old Henry was too quiet, his usual boundless energy replaced by a stillness that terrified her more than any complaint. Just 3 days earlier, hope had felt like a tangible thing. Margaret had packed their entire lives into their aging sedan. Boxes filled with the remnants of a marriage that had ended barely a month prior. Years of emotional manipulation and quiet heartbreak were finally behind them. This journey was meant to be their fresh start. A new job waited for her in Harmony Creek, a small town nestled on the other side of these very mountains. It was more than just a job. It was a chance to rebuild, a chance to create a sense of safety that had been shattered over the years, a chance to simply breathe. The weather forecast had mentioned snow, a gentle, picturesque dusting, perfect for a fresh start. It mentioned nothing, absolutely nothing, like the biblical storm that now raged outside, a furious white curtain that had swallowed the world. The trouble had started subtly, a slick patch on the isolated mountain road, Blackwood Pass. Then, a sickening lurch, a loss of control she fought desperately against, and the car skidded. It came to rest lodged against a snowdrift, the engine dying with a final, sputtering cough that sounded tragically like a sigh. That's when the first real tendrils of fear had wrapped around her heart. No cell service, no passing cars, just an endless, featureless white void stretching in every direction, and the temperature dropping with alarming speed as nightfall descended. The small cave, the whispering hollow, had seemed like a miracle at first. Shelter from the relentless wind and the biting snow, a place to catch their breath, to regroup. But as the hours crawled by, slow and agonizing, the cold had penetrated their inadequate clothing, seeping deep into their bones. With a growing horror that stole her breath, Margaret realized their mistake. They had simply traded one death for another, a slower, colder one. The tears that tracked paths down her cheeks froze instantly in the frigid air. This forgotten cave in the mountains, she thought, this dark, cold opening, might very well become their tomb. It was a terrible thought, one that crystallized in her mind with the clarity of ice. She whispered a desperate prayer into the darkness of the cave, a prayer for warmth, for help, for a miracle they desperately needed. It was a prayer born of a mother's fierce, unyielding love, a plea sent out into the void where logic suggested no one could possibly hear. Looking at Clara and Henry, their small faces pale and vulnerable in the dim light, the familiar ache in her chest tightened. The divorce had taken so much. Their home, the comfortable familiarity of their daily lives, the financial security she had always taken for granted. It had even taken some friends, people she had known for years, who had somehow felt the need to choose sides. But she still had her children. And in that moment, pulling them close in the freezing darkness, she knew that made her wealthy beyond any measure of money or possessions. The irony, sharp and bitter, was not lost on her. After fighting so hard, enduring so much to build a new life for them, they might not live to see it. Could a single moment of desperation truly be the end of the road, when everything you've worked for, everything you are, is stripped away by forces you cannot control? What is left but to hope and to pray? It's a question that hangs in the cold air, a whispered worry in the vast, indifferent night. This journey, the one that had brought them shivering to the brink of disaster in the whispering hollow, was supposed to be a fresh start. It was meant to be the opening chapter in a brand new life, far away from the echoes of the old one. Just 3 days ago, the air in their small, rented apartment had hummed with a fragile kind of hope. Margaret had packed their few possessions with a quiet determination, each box a small victory against the years that had worn her down. The divorce had been finalized for barely a month, a quiet, anticlimactic end to years of emotional manipulation and heartbreak that had slowly, insidiously eroded her sense of self. She wasn't leaving because she wanted to. She was leaving because she had to, for her and for the children. Harmony Creek awaited them on the other side of these mountains. A small town, the kind with a main street and a community feel, where she had secured a teaching position at the elementary school. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was steady. It offered health insurance and a chance to provide for Clara and Henry without the constant, gnawing anxiety about making ends meet that had become her unwelcome companion. More than that, it offered a chance to rebuild the sense of safety that had been so brutally shattered within the walls of her own home. Safety wasn't just about physical protection, it was about emotional security, about knowing that the ground beneath your feet wouldn't suddenly give way. The drive had started well enough. The aging sedan, packed to the brim, chugged faithfully along, a symbol of their overloaded but resilient spirit. They'd sung along to the radio, played car games, and pointed out the first dusting of snow on the distant peaks, excited by the novelty of it. The weather forecast had been so casual about the snow, mentioning a light accumulation, nothing to worry about. Margaret, ever cautious, had packed extra blankets and a small emergency kit, but she hadn't anticipated anything like this. As they'd started their ascent into Blackwood Pass, the sky had turned a bruised, ominous purple-gray. Flakes had begun to fall, not gently, but with an aggressive, driven force. Within minutes, visibility had dropped to near zero, the wind whipping the snow into a frenzy. That's when the road, already slick and winding, became treacherous. The car, tires struggling for traction, had begun to slide. Margaret gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, her heart leaping into her throat. She tried to correct, to steer into the skid, everything she'd ever learned about driving in winter flashing through her mind, but the ice held them captive. The world outside became a blur of white and motion. The sickening lurch as the car left the road was a sound she knew she would never forget. It was the sound of their fragile hopes crashing. They had come to rest jammed against a snowdrift, the engine coughing, sputtering, and then falling silent. A heavy, suffocating silence that was punctuated only by the roar of the wind and the frantic beating of Margaret's own heart. She tried the ignition key again and again, but the engine was dead. Utterly, terrifyingly dead. That's when the first real tendrils of fear had wrapped around her heart. It wasn't just the fear of being stuck. It was the fear of their isolation. No cell signal. The bars on her phone stubbornly, mockingly, blank. No other cars on this remote stretch of road. Just an endless, featureless white void stretching in every direction, growing darker by the minute as night approached. And the temperature. She could feel it dropping, rapidly, dangerously. The hours since had been a blur of desperate action and mounting dread, trying to dig the car out, quickly realizing it was impossible, gathering the blankets, the meager emergency supplies, spotting the dark opening of the cave, the whispering hollow, and the desperate dash for its promise of shelter. Now, huddled inside, that initial relief had long since vanished, replaced by the creeping, bone-deep cold. The journey that was meant to be their liberation felt terrifyingly like a path to their end. Was every step she took towards freedom just leading her further into a trap? It was a chilling thought, one she tried to push away, focusing instead on the small, vulnerable lives huddled beside her, the lives she had fought so hard to protect, only to find them facing this impossible, frozen wall. Shelter found? Yes. But as the brutal hours wore on, huddled together in the damp, cold confines of the whispering hollow, Margaret felt the dawning horror of realizing they had merely traded one form of slow death for another. The fierce wind was somewhat muted here, a low, mournful howl rather than a scream. But the cold was a physical presence, an enemy that seeped into everything. It wasn't the biting, surface cold of a crisp winter day. It was a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to reach into their very bones, promising numbness, then stillness. Clara whispered, her voice thin and reedy, barely audible over the persistent wind. "Mommy, I'm so cold." Margaret's heart ached with a pain that was sharper than the cold itself. Her 7-year-old daughter, usually so full of chatter and questions, looked impossibly small and fragile. Her little brother, Henry, only 5, had stopped complaining entirely a while ago. He simply shivered, his eyes wide and fixed on Margaret's face, a silent plea that was far more frightening than his earlier tears or whines. Margaret struggled to keep her voice steady, a difficult task when she could feel the tremor starting deep within her own core. "I know, sweetheart. Just stay close." She had already done everything she could. Stripped off her spare clothes, a thin sweater and an old scarf, and awkwardly draped the sweater over Clara, wrapping the scarf multiple times around Henry's tiny frame. Now, her own thin jacket offered almost no protection against the relentless cold of the cave. Her teeth chattered, and she could feel the cold seeping through the thin soles of her boots, but she would endure it. She would endure anything, any amount of cold, any amount of pain, if it would just buy her children a few more hours of life, a few more hours for a miracle to somehow, impossibly, find them. The cruel irony of their situation wasn't lost on her. She had fought tooth and nail through a painful divorce, navigated the labyrinthine complexities of starting over, faced down her fears and anxieties to create a new, safer life for her children. She had battled against emotional manipulation and financial insecurity, determined to give them a stable, happy future. And now, after all that, after all the resilience she had summoned, they were trapped here, on a deserted mountain, in a forgotten cave, facing an enemy as ancient and indifferent as the cold itself. The divorce had taken their home, their financial security, even some of the people she had considered friends, but it hadn't taken her children. And she had clung to that truth, that they were her wealth, her everything. Now, even that felt threatened. As the hours wore on, the cold intensified. Margaret rubbed her hands together, trying to generate some friction, some warmth, but her fingers felt clumsy and distant. She quietly worked her toes inside her boots, desperate to maintain circulation. Her extremities had long since gone numb, a disturbing detachment from her own body. The cave that had seemed like salvation now felt like a perfectly designed trap, shielding them from the immediate fury of the storm outside, only to subject them to the slower, insidious creep of hypothermia. The silence of the mountain, broken only by the wind, pressed in on them. There was no sign of rescue, no hope of anyone knowing where they were. How much hope can a heart hold when the very air you breathe feels like ice? It was a question that resonated in the frigid air, heavy with the weight of their grim reality. Looking at her children, their eyes fluttering closed despite her efforts to keep them awake, Margaret felt a wave of despair wash over her. This wasn't just cold, this was the edge of something far more permanent. This was the mini-climax of their struggle for survival. The moment the harsh truth fully settled in, the cave was not a solution. It was merely a temporary, insufficient pause on the road to the inevitable. "Mommy, I'm so cold," Clara whispered again, her small voice a fragile thread in the cold air of the Whispering Hollow. Margaret pulled her closer, rubbing the little girl's arms through the borrowed sweater, a futile gesture against the deep chill. Henry was silent, his eyes wide and fixed, a look that tugged at Margaret's heart. She knew she had to do something, anything, to distract them from the cold, from the fear that was a palpable thing in the cave. "Tell us a story," Henry mumbled suddenly, his first words in over an hour. The sound, though quiet, was a lifeline. It was a request for normalcy, a plea to be taken away from the harsh reality of their situation, if only for a few minutes. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight with fear and the biting cold. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice cracking slightly, but she pushed through it, drawing on a reserve of strength she didn't know she had. She needed to transport them, and herself, to a different world, a world where brave knights faced magical challenges and hope was always on the horizon. She spun an improvised tale, pulling details from forgotten childhood books and fleeting daydreams. There was a brave knight, she told them, and his 2 loyal squires, who were journeying through a magical winter forest when they became lost. The storm in the story was fierce, the trees tall and imposing, but the knight was clever and kind, and he knew they couldn't give up. As she spoke, she checked her watch. Nearly midnight. They had been in the cave for 6 long, brutal hours. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since sunset, maybe more, and the storm outside showed no signs of abating. Each word she spoke was a small act of defiance against the mounting despair. She described how the night, realizing they needed help, decided to send out a magical call, a signal that someone, somewhere, might hear. Like a prayer, Henry asked, his voice small but clear, his eyes large in his pale face as he looked up at her. The question, so simple and innocent, landed in Margaret's heart with profound weight. Yes, exactly like a prayer. It was the unspoken truth at the core of her improvised tale. Her story wasn't just a distraction. It was a vessel for her desperate hope. She pulled them even closer, the three of them a small, tight circle of shared warmth in the vast, indifferent cold. Yes, exactly like a prayer, she repeated, her voice a little stronger now. The night knew that if they all sent out their magical call together, with all their hearts, it would be stronger. She looked at her children, seeing the flicker of interest in their eyes, the brief escape from the cold reality. Let's all send out a magical call together. Okay, to Clara and Henry. It was a game, a way to participate in Mommy's story, a small adventure in the dark. They closed their eyes, little brows furrowed in concentration, and whispered their magical calls into the cave. For Margaret, though, the whispered plea they sent into the darkness held the full, agonizing weight of a dying mother's desperation. It was more than a game. It was her last, desperate gamble. She thought of her own mother, gone 5 years now to cancer, a strong woman, a resilient woman who had taught Margaret how to face adversity. I'm sorry, Mom, she thought, the unspoken words a painful lump in her throat. I tried to be strong like you taught me. Hours crawled by, marked only by the deepening cold and Margaret's relentless battle against sleep. The children drifted in and out of a dangerous slumber, their small bodies too still. Margaret fought to prevent it, shaking them gently whenever their eyes stayed closed too long. Her own exhaustion was a physical weight, pulling her down, luring her toward a slumber she knew, with chilling certainty, might be permanent. We need to stay awake, she murmured, the words as much for herself as for them. She pinched her arm hard enough to bruise, a sharp, necessary pain to ward off the encroaching lethargy, just until morning. Help will come in the morning. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie, a necessary lie to keep hope flickering, however faintly. The storm, according to the last forecast she'd seen, was predicted to last another day. At least, no one knew exactly where they were. Blackwood Pass was remote, and their car was likely buried under a significant amount of snow by now. The statistical probability of rescue felt vanishingly small, a number so close to zero it was almost meaningless. It was a grim realization, the mini-climax of this struggle for consciousness and hope. How much hope can a heart hold when the very air you breathe feels like ice enough? She prayed, just enough to last until what? Until something, anything, changed? When the world outside is a white chaos, a blinding, freezing void, sometimes salvation arrives in the most unexpected form. Sometimes it has golden fur and intelligent eyes that seem to hold a knowing light in the darkness. Margaret was shaking Clara gently again, trying to rouse her from the dangerous, lethargic sleep that kept pulling them down. The storm outside continued its mournful howl, a constant reminder of their isolation. She murmured reassurances she didn't feel, pinching her arm again, trying to hold on to consciousness. And then, something happened. Clara stirred against her, her small fingers weakly clutching at Margaret's shirt. "Mommy, I think I see something." Margaret, her mind clouded with cold and exhaustion, assumed her daughter was becoming disoriented. It was a common symptom of severe cold, she knew, hallucinations. It's just the shadows. "Honey," she soothed, her voice thick. "Don't worry." "No," Clara insisted, her voice gaining a flicker of urgency that cut through Margaret's stupor. "Look at the cave entrance." Margaret raised her head slowly, every small movement an effort. Conserving energy even for this? At first, all she saw was the same scene that had tormented her for hours, swirling snow against absolute darkness, the wind whipping it into chaotic patterns. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, and then she saw it. A flash of movement. A shape distinct from the swirling white. Something that didn't belong to the storm or the rock of the cave. Golden fur, catching the faint moonlight that somehow penetrated the thick curtain of snow. Intelligent eyes reflecting like twin ambers in the darkness, fixed directly on them. A dog. It was a dog. A beautiful golden retriever, standing calmly at the cave entrance. Its posture was alert, watchful, but somehow serene despite the raging storm around it. It tilted its head, studying them with an intensity that seemed almost human, an ancient, knowing gaze. A dog, Margaret whispered, the word feeling foreign on her frozen lips. Was this real? Had hypothermia finally progressed to the point of hallucination? Was her mind conjuring an image of warmth and life to ease her last moments? The animal padded forward, its paws leaving wet imprints on the cold stone floor of the cave. It moved with a quiet confidence, an undeniable physical presence. It was real, impossibly, wonderfully real. Henry, roused by Clara's voice and Margaret's whispered exclamation, extended a trembling hand towards the creature. "Good doggy." The dog approached cautiously, its gaze still fixed on them, assessing. It allowed Ben's frost-nipped white fingers to brush against its warm fur for just a moment, a fleeting connection in the cold. Then, it turned back toward the cave entrance. It looked over its shoulder at them, took a few steps out into the swirling chaos of the storm, and then looked back again, a clear, expectant posture. "I think," Clara said slowly, her voice filled with a child's simple certainty, "I think he wants us to follow him." "That's crazy," Margaret murmured automatically. The logical part of her brain, numbed by cold and shock, immediately rejecting the idea. He's probably just a stray, or a runaway from a nearby house. But even as she said the words, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in her chest. It was absurd. Following a strange dog into a deadly blizzard, it was madness. Yet, the dog's behavior was too deliberate, too purposeful to be random. It returned to them, nudging Margaret's hand with its wet nose, then gently, surprisingly carefully, tugged at her sleeve before moving towards the entrance again. It wasn't begging, it was inviting, it was leading. "He's trying to help us," Clara insisted, her voice firm with the absolute conviction only a child possesses. Margaret weighed their options, which were brutally, terrifyingly few. Stay here in the Whispering Hollow and certainly freeze to death, mourning the loss of hope as the cold claimed them, or follow this mysterious animal into the heart of the storm on the slimmest, most improbable chance of salvation. It was a gamble, a desperate, irrational leap of faith. But looking at the dog, silhouetted against the swirling snow, his gaze steady and patient, Margaret felt something shift within her. The mini-climax of this moment wasn't just the dog's appearance, but the dawning, terrifying possibility that it offered. In the deepest darkness, could a single, unexpected light truly change everything she thought she knew about the world? It was a question that demanded an answer, a question that pulled her, hesitantly, to her feet. It was a desperate gamble, an act of faith that defied all logic. But looking at Scout, standing patiently at the edge of the storm, Margaret made her decision. Stay in the Whispering Hollow and succumb to the cold, a slow, inevitable surrender. Or trust this mysterious animal and step back out into the white fury, risking everything on the slimmest chance of salvation. Maternal instinct, a force more powerful than any storm. One out. "Okay," she decided, the word feeling impossibly loud in the quiet of the cave. She struggled to her feet, her limbs stiff and protesting from the cold, and pulled Clara and Henry up with her. "We'll follow him, but stay right next to me. Both of you, hold my hands and don't let go." The first step outside the cave was like walking into a physical wall of ice. The wind stole Margaret's breath, snatching it from her lungs with brutal force. It was colder, far colder, than it had been inside the cave, despite the biting chill that had settled in her bones. For a moment, a wave of doubt so profound it nearly buckled her knees washed over her. Had she just made the biggest mistake of their lives? Had she led her children out of a slow death and into a fast one? But Scout was already moving, a golden shape against the swirling white, stepping confidently through the deepening snow. He moved with a purpose that Margaret, even through her fear and the physical shock of the cold, couldn't ignore. He wasn't just wandering, he was leading. He occasionally paused, looking back to ensure they were following, a silent, patient guide in the chaos. Every step was agony. The snow reached mid-thigh in places, a heavy, dragging weight that fought against their progress. Margaret's legs, already weakened by cold and exhaustion, burned with the effort. Henry, bless his heart, tried to walk, but his small legs couldn't manage the deep drifts. Margaret often had to lift him entirely, carrying him for stretches, his small body a dead weight against her side, before her strength gave out and she had to put him down again, urging him to walk just a little further. Clara trudged beside her, her small face set in a mask of determination that belied her 7 years. She didn't complain, didn't cry, just held Margaret's hand tightly and followed Scout's golden shape ahead. The wind howled around them, a constant disorienting roar that made it impossible to hear anything else. The snow stung their faces, melting on contact only to refreeze instantly. Margaret's lungs burned with the effort of breathing the frigid air. Her body, already at its limit from the hours in the cave, was protesting violently against this renewed assault. She focused on Scout, on his unwavering progress, clinging to the hope that he knew where he was going, that this wasn't just a random animal instinct, but something more. They had been following the dog for what felt like an eternity, though her frozen mind struggled to measure time. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30. Margaret wasn't sure. All she knew was the burning in her legs, the ache in her arms from carrying Henry, the desperate, gasping struggle for breath. And then, she couldn't. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to her knees in the deep snow, pulling the children down with her. "I can't," she gasped, the words ripped from her lungs by the wind. "I can't go any further." Her body was shutting down, the cold and the exertion finally winning. This was it, she thought, the mini-climax of this desperate trek. They had tried, they had followed the improbable hope, but they had failed. The storm had won. But Scout didn't give up. He returned instantly, nudging her with his head, his warm body pressing against hers for a fleeting moment of comfort. His eyes, those intelligent amber eyes, seemed to reflect an understanding that defied explanation. He barked once, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the roar of the wind, the first sound they had heard from him. It wasn't a bark of impatience or frustration, but something else, something urgent, something that drew their eyes forward. Could a dog's persistent nudge, a single bark in the storm, be the push they needed just when Margaret thought her body could take no more, when the cold and the exhaustion threatened to pull her down into the snow for good? Scout barked, not a frantic bark, but a sharp, clear sound that seemed to demand attention, to cut through the disorienting roar of the wind. He was standing before her, his golden fur dusted with snow, his intelligent eyes fixed on hers. He nudged her again, then turned and looked out into the blizzard, barking once more. It was a clear signal. "Look! Look!" Clara shouted, her voice thin but filled with a sudden, desperate excitement that sliced through Margaret's despair. She was pointing ahead, past Scout, into the curtain of swirling snow. "Mommy, look!" Margaret forced herself to lift her head, following her daughter's gaze. Through the chaotic dance of the snowflakes, past the immediate blinding white, something glimmered, lights, not the distant cold pinpricks of stars, if any could even be seen through this storm, but something closer, warmer. They were soft, golden rectangles, visible only faintly through the thick, driven snow, but they were undeniably the lights of windows. A building, a large one, it seemed, standing less than 100 yards away. "Oh my God," Margaret breathed, the words a prayer of their own. The sight of those lights, so unexpected, so improbable in this remote wilderness, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. It was like a J defibrillator paddle applied directly to her heart, shocking her system back to life. Suddenly, the burning in her legs, the ache in her arms, the bone-deep cold all seemed to recede, replaced by a surge of desperate, urgent energy. Hope, fierce and bright, flared in her chest. "Come on, "Kids," she urged, her voice stronger than she thought possible. "We're almost there." She pushed herself back to her feet, pulling Clara and Henry up with her. The snow still dragged at their legs. The wind still tore at their clothes. But now they had a destination, a beacon in the white void. Scout moved ahead, a living compass, leading them unerringly towards the glimmering lights. He didn't hesitate, didn't waver, as if he had walked this path countless times before. Every step was still a struggle, but it was a struggle fueled by renewed purpose. Margaret kept a tight grip on her children's hands, pulling them forward, their small bodies stumbling in the deep snow. Clara, her face still pale, mirrored Margaret's newfound determination. Henry, sensing the shift, found a reserve of energy he hadn't had moments before. As they drew closer, the building's silhouette began to emerge from the storm, a dark, imposing shape against the white landscape. It was massive, a structure with the unmistakable grandeur of old wealth, of a different time, a mansion, impossibly located here, deep in the mountains, in the middle of a raging blizzard. Who would build something like this here, and who would be here now, lights blazing, in the heart of such a storm? The questions flickered through Margaret's mind, but she pushed them aside. The only thing that mattered was the warmth, the safety, the promise of shelter those golden windows held. By the time they reached the front steps, Margaret was practically dragging both children. Her own legs felt like lead, her lungs burned, and her vision had begun to tunnel, darkness creeping in at the edges as her body approached its absolute limit. But they were here. They had made it. Scout bounded ahead, a final burst of energy, disappearing around the side of the house as they stumbled onto the imposing stone steps. "Wait," Margaret called weakly, a fresh wave of fear washing over her at the thought of losing their guide just when they had reached their destination. Relief at finding shelter warred with the sudden panic of being alone again. She pulled herself and the children up the steps, each one feeling like a monumental climb. They reached the massive front door, a heavy, ornate barrier that seemed to stand sentinel against the storm. With the last of her strength, Margaret raised a trembling fist and knocked. The sound was feeble, swallowed almost instantly by the wind and the sheer solidity of the wood. No answer came. She knocked again, harder this time, desperation lending a surprising force to the motion. Still nothing. Was it abandoned? Were the lights a trick of the storm? Had they come all this way, endured so much, only to find an empty house? Then, Clara, with the uninhibited directness of childhood, reached past her mother and tried the ornate door handle. To Margaret's astonishment, it turned easily. The door wasn't locked. "It's open," Clara said, stating the fact as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if finding an unlocked mansion in the middle of a blizzard was an everyday occurrence. The heavy door swung inward, revealing a cavernous entryway bathed in warm, golden light. The sight, the sudden rush of heat that flowed out to embrace them, was so overwhelming, so sudden, that it was almost painful. The contrast to the freezing storm they had just escaped was breathtaking. "Hello," Margaret called, her voice hoarse, echoing in the vast space. "Is anyone here? We're stranded travelers. We need help." Only silence answered, broken by the steady, rhythmic ticking of an unseen clock, a sound that somehow emphasized the emptiness of the grand house. But they were inside. They were out of the cold. That was all that mattered in that moment. The mini-climax of reaching this impossible haven, the door swinging open to reveal a world of warmth after facing certain death, was a moment of profound, life-altering grace. Sometimes, the lights that guide you home appear just when you've given up hope of ever seeing them, and sometimes the door is simply left open, waiting, an unlocked door in the middle of nowhere, a silent invitation into warmth and light after facing the absolute, freezing darkness. They stumbled inside, closing the heavy door against the raging storm with a solid thud that felt strangely final. The entryway that greeted them was vast, a cavernous space bathed in the warm glow spilling from unseen light fixtures. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and beeswax polish, a stark, luxurious contrast to the biting, icy air they had just escaped. Heat, blessed heat, flowed out to embrace them, a physical sensation so intense after the prolonged cold that it was almost painful, bringing a rush of tingling, aching feeling back to Margaret's numb limbs. The entrance hall was magnificent, marble floors that gleamed in the light, a sweeping staircase that curved gracefully upwards into the shadows, antique furniture that spoke not just of wealth, but of generations of taste and care. But it was the warmth that truly made Margaret want to weep with sheer gratitude, actual, blessed warmth, wrapping around her like a physical embrace, chasing away the deep, insidious chill that had settled in her bones. "Where is everyone?" Henry asked, his voice small in the grand space, echoing slightly. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, helping the children shed their wet, snow-laden outer layers, the discarded clothing pooling on the pristine floor like dark, defeated shapes. "But we're out of the cold. That's what matters right now." As sensation painfully returned to her extremities, Margaret took the proper stock of their surroundings. The mansion was immaculately maintained. Not a speck of dust was visible on any surface, the air clean and still. Yet, despite the warmth and the light, it felt empty, not abandoned exactly, but waiting. As though its occupants had simply stepped out moments before, expecting to return any second. "Mommy, look at all the pictures," Clara said, her voice hushed with awe, wandering towards the nearest wall. Portraits lined the hallway, oil paintings in heavy, gilded frames. Most of them depicted the same man at different ages, a handsome man, with an intelligent gaze and the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority and success. He seemed to look out from the canvases with a quiet intensity, his eyes following them as they moved through the hall. In the largest portrait, a prominent one positioned at the center, the man stood beside a dog, the very same golden retriever that had led them here. "Walter Hayes," Margaret read from the small brass plaque beneath the central portrait. The name felt important, resonant in the silent house. "Who are you, Mr. Hayes?" she murmured softly, more to herself than anyone. "And why is your home unlocked in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. A sudden bark made them all jump, the sound sharp and unexpected in the quiet grandeur. Scout had reappeared, seemingly from nowhere, sitting calmly at the base of the sweeping staircase, as if he had been waiting for them to notice him. "There you are!" Henry exclaimed with delight, running towards the dog, all traces of his earlier fear momentarily forgotten. "Thank you for saving us, doggy." Scout wagged his tail once, a slow, deliberate sweep against the marble floor, then turned and trotted deeper into the mansion, disappearing down a wide hallway. "I think," Clara said, her voice thoughtful, "I think he wants us to follow him again." Margaret hesitated. Her maternal instincts, so recently focused on physical survival, were now on high alert regarding human safety. "Wait," she cautioned. "We don't know whose house this is. We can't just wander around." But Henry, with a child's simple, undeniable logic, reasoned, "But the dog lives here. See, he's in the picture with that man. So, it's okay." Before Margaret could formulate a response, the sound of footsteps echoed from above, heavy, measured steps descending the grand staircase. Margaret instinctively pulled her children behind her, shielding them protectively, turning to face the stairs with a mixture of apprehension and relief. At least they weren't alone anymore. Though whether that would prove to be a good thing or a bad thing remained to be seen. A man appeared on the landing, tall and imposing, with silver-streaked dark hair and a face mapped with deep lines of experience, like a well-worn map. He was perhaps in his early 60s, dressed in a heavy sweater and wool pants, clothes that looked practical and well-worn, contrasting with the opulence of the house. His expression upon seeing them was one of absolute, unadulterated shock. It was the mini-climax of this unsettling arrival, the moment the owner, or at least an inhabitant, of this impossible place revealed himself, shattering the eerie silence with a challenge. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice a deep rumble that filled the hall. "And what are you doing in my house?" The man's question hung in the air, his face a mask of suspicion and surprise, leaving Margaret with a chilling uncertainty about their newfound shelter. Who was this man, and why did his eyes hold so much weariness and suspicion? A roof over their heads. That was the immediate, overwhelming reality. A safe, warm roof after facing the absolute certainty of freezing to death. The man, George Thompson, stood on the bottom step, his gaze sharp and assessing, taking in their disheveled, snow-covered appearance, the pale faces of the children huddled behind Margaret. His question hung in the air, heavy with suspicion. "I'm sorry for the intrusion," Margaret said, struggling to keep her voice steady, to project an air of calm she didn't feel. Her instincts screamed caution, but desperation had brought them to this doorstep. "Our car broke down in the storm on Blackwood Pass. We were sheltering in a cave, the Whispering Hollow, when your dog found us and led us here. The door was unlocked." George's gaze shifted to Scout, who had returned to sit calmly beside them, shaking off the last remnants of snow from his golden coat, as if he belonged there entirely. The man's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at the dog, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "My dog," he repeated, a strange, hollow note in his voice. "I don't have a dog." An awkward silence fell, punctuated only by the distant howl of the wind outside and the steady ticking of the unseen clock. Margaret, Clara, and Henry looked at Scout, who sat serenely, then back at George Thompson, then to the portrait of Walter Hayes above the fireplace, where the golden retriever was clearly depicted standing beside the man who looked so much like George. "But he's in the portrait," Clara said, pointing a small, still slightly trembling finger towards the painting. "With that man?" The stranger's eyes narrowed as he descended the remaining stairs, his movements measured and deliberate. Up close, Margaret could see the deep shadows beneath his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested either age or some great, ongoing strain. "That's not me in the portrait," he said, his voice gruff but losing some of its initial aggression. "That's Walter Hayes. This was his house." "Was?" Margaret questioned, the word a small, uncertain sound. "He disappeared 5 years ago," George replied, studying them critically. His gaze lingered on Clara and Henry, their vulnerability seemingly softening his hardened exterior. "You really were caught in the storm." Margaret nodded, unable to articulate the true extent of how close they had come to the end. "We nearly died out there. I'm Margaret Miller. These are my children, Clara and Henry." "George Thompson," he replied after a moment's hesitation, offering his name like a reluctant offering. "I'm the caretaker." Something in his tone suggested this wasn't the entire truth, that the title didn't fully encompass his role here, but Margaret was in no position to challenge him. "Please," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength, a mother pleading for her children. "We just need shelter until the storm passes. The children are exhausted and hungry." George's gaze softened further as he looked at Clara and Henry, who were indeed swaying on their feet with exhaustion after their ordeal. "Fine," he conceded, the word heavy with a weary resignation. "You can stay until the road's clear. There's plenty of room. God knows." He turned abruptly, the moment of vulnerability vanishing behind his gruff demeanor. "Follow me. You need dry clothes and food." He led them up the grand staircase, the marble steps cool beneath Margaret's damp socks. Scout trotted alongside them, as if he had been part of their group all along, confirming Henry's innocent belief that the dog belonged here. "If the dog isn't yours," Henry asked innocently, looking up at George, "whose is he?" George glanced at Scout with an unreadable expression. "As I said, he belonged to Hayes." "But that was 5 years ago," Margaret pointed out, a new question forming in her mind. "Who's been taking care of him?" "He comes and goes," George replied vaguely, avoiding her eyes. "Sometimes I don't see him for weeks. Then he just appears, like tonight." They reached a long hallway lined with doors, all equally grand and imposing. George opened one, revealing a spacious bedroom with an adjoining bathroom. It was furnished with heavy, antique pieces, a 4-poster bed dominating the room, but it was warm and dry. "You and the girl can take this room," he said. "The boy can have the room next door." "I want to stay with Mommy," Henry protested immediately, clinging to Margaret's leg, his earlier weariness momentarily forgotten in a surge of anxiety about being separated. George sighed, a sound of mild exasperation. "Fine. There's a trundle bed that can be pulled out." He gestured towards the massive 4-poster. "Bathroom has everything you need. I'll find you some dry clothes." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Kitchen's downstairs. First door past the dining room. Help yourselves. I don't do meals." With that, he was gone, leaving them alone in the sumptuous bedroom. The silence returned, broken only by the distant sounds of the storm and the children's quiet movements. Scout, however, remained. He walked into the room as if he owned it and settled himself comfortably on the plush rug near the fireplace. A silent, golden guardian. "He's not very friendly," Clara observed, sitting tentatively on the edge of the massive bed. "He let us stay," Margaret reminded her, already moving towards the adjoining bathroom, the thought of hot water for the children a sudden, overwhelming desire. "That's friendly enough for me right now." As Margaret started the bath, the warmth and safety of the room began to truly sink in. They were safe. For now. Looking back at Scout, curled peacefully on the rug, she couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival here, guided by him, was more than just chance. It was a mini-climax of sorts, arriving at this unexpected haven, only to find it held its own set of mysteries and a man with a past he wasn't eager to share. Who was George Thompson, and why did his eyes hold so much weariness and suspicion? What was his connection to Walter Hayes and the dog he claimed not to own? These questions lingered in the warm air, promising that their unexpected stop on Blackwood Pass was far from over. Within an hour, the immediate pressing needs were met. Both Clara and Henry were bathed, the hot water chasing away the deep cold and leaving their skin pink and warm. They were dressed in oversized t-shirts and soft, flannel pants George had left discreetly outside their door, clothes that smelled faintly of cedar and a life lived here. Too exhausted to process anything more, they were fast asleep in the comfortable beds. Scout curled protectively on the rug between their rooms. Margaret took her own turn in the bath, sinking into the hot water with a sigh that seemed to release hours of tension. It was the first moment she'd had alone, a chance to finally process the sheer terror of the day. They had nearly died. The realization hit her with a delayed, heavy force, bringing fresh tears to her eyes. Tears that weren't from the cold this time. If not for the mysterious dog, still keeping watch in their bedroom, they would certainly have perished in that cave. After dressing in the borrowed clothes, soft sweatpants and a flannel shirt that felt like a luxury, Margaret found herself too wired for sleep despite her exhaustion. The adrenaline crash left her both drained and oddly alert, her mind replaying the events of the day. The mansion was eerily quiet now that the children were asleep. The only sounds were her own soft footsteps on the carpeted stairs and the occasional creak of old wood settling, the house breathing around her. Scout raised his head as she moved towards the door, his eyes following her with that same unnerving intelligence. "I'm just going to find something to eat," she whispered. And was that a gentle micro-CTA embedded in the quiet interaction? A soft acknowledgement of his role. Stay with the kids. Okay. As if understanding perfectly, the golden retriever settled back down, his gaze fixed protectively on the sleeping children. The kitchen, when she finally found it after a few wrong turns down opulent hallways, was a striking blend of old-world charm and modern convenience. Copper pots hung gleaming above a huge center island, alongside stainless steel appliances that looked barely used. It was a room built for grand meals and bustling activity, but tonight it was silent and still. She was making herself a simple sandwich, the mundane act feeling surreal after the day's drama, when George Thompson's voice came from the doorway, making her start and nearly drop the knife. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. "You move very quietly," Margaret managed, her heart still thumping. "Old habit," he replied, entering the kitchen without asking, a silent, almost predatory grace to his movements. He went to a cabinet, removed a bottle and 2 glasses, and poured an amber liquid into each. He slid one toward her across the island. "You look like you could use this." Margaret accepted the offered whiskey with a small nod of thanks. It felt strange, sitting in this stranger's opulent kitchen, sharing a drink after being led here by a dog he claimed not to own. "It's been a day," she understated, taking a sip. The warmth spread through her chest, a different kind of comfort than the heat of the house. "Nearly dying will do that," George said dryly, taking a seat at the island opposite her. Up close, in the better light of the kitchen, Margaret could study him properly. His features were rugged rather than handsome, weathered by time and what appeared to be considerable hardship. There was an alertness to him, a coiled tension that never quite dissipated, even when he was sitting still. "You don't seem surprised by strangers showing up during a blizzard," she observed, venturing a question. George took a long sip of his drink, his eyes distant. "Nothing surprises me anymore." "You said you're the caretaker," Margaret ventured further, pushing gently. "But you live here alone." "I prefer solitude," he replied, his expression hardening slightly. "In a house this size?" He looked directly at her, his gaze sharp. "I didn't realize accommodation came with an interrogation." Margaret held up her hands in apology. "Sorry, I'm just trying to understand our situation here. Everything that's happened today, it's a lot." For a moment, she thought he would shut down completely, retreating behind his gruff exterior. But then something in his posture shifted, a subtle relaxation. "Hayes was a friend," he said, his tone softening marginally, offering a small piece of the puzzle. "When he disappeared, he left provisions for the maintenance of the property." He paused, looking into his glass. "I needed somewhere isolated. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement." "What happened to him, Mr. Hayes?" Margaret asked, sensing this was a sensitive point. George's fingers tightened around his glass. "No one knows. One day he was here, the next he wasn't. The official investigation found nothing." A bitter note entered his voice. "They never do." Something in his words struck Margaret as odd. "They never do." As if he knew something about investigations. "Were you part of the investigation?" she asked, the question coming unbidden. His eyes met hers again, sharp and assessing. "What makes you ask that?" "Just a feeling," she replied carefully. "You don't speak like a caretaker. You speak like someone used to authority, like a cop." A shadow of a smile, fleeting and sad, touched his lips. "Perceptive. I was a detective. Metro City homicide. Retired now." "And you ended up here," Margaret said, the pieces beginning to connect, forming a picture she didn't yet fully understand. Caretaking a missing billionaire's mansion in the middle of nowhere? It seemed like a dramatic change, a deliberate hiding away. "We all end up somewhere," he said simply, his gaze distant again. "Sometimes we choose the place, sometimes it chooses us." The cryptic response raised more questions than it answered, but Margaret sensed it would be unwise to push further tonight. Instead, she changed the subject, returning to the most immediate mystery. "The dog," she said, her voice softer now. "He saved our lives today, led us right to your door." George's expression grew distant again. "He does that sometimes, brings in strays." "Strays?" Margaret echoed, slightly offended on behalf of herself and her children. "No offense meant," George amended quickly. "But you're not the first people he's guided here during a storm." "Has he ever led people to their deaths?" Margaret asked, a chill running through her despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Because that cave was a death trap." "No," George said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with a sudden, intense seriousness. "He only saves, never endangers." He finished his drink in one swallow. "The storm should pass by tomorrow evening. The main road will be plowed by the following morning." "Thank you for letting us stay," Margaret said sincerely, feeling a wave of genuine gratitude wash over her. George nodded once, then rose to leave. At the doorway, he paused, his back to her. "The dog," he said without turning. "Hayes called him Scout." "Scout," Margaret repeated, trying the name. "It suits him." "Yes," George agreed softly. "It does." After he had gone, leaving her alone in the quiet kitchen with her sandwich and the lingering taste of whiskey, Margaret sat for a long time, thinking. She had come seeking shelter from a storm, a physical storm, but it seemed she had stumbled into a place holding the echoes of a different kind of tempest, a storm of loss and secrets. Who was George Thompson, and why did his eyes hold so much weariness and suspicion? What was his connection to Walter Hayes and the dog he claimed not to own? These questions were the mini-climax of this conversation, pulling her deeper into the mansion's mystery. Perhaps, she thought, Scout had led them here for reasons they couldn't yet comprehend. Could finding safety from one storm lead you directly into the heart of another? It felt that way tonight. The morning brought a tentative, weak sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains of the bedroom, a gentle contrast to the storm's fury of the night before, and with it came the delighted giggles of her children. Margaret opened her eyes to find Clara and Henry already awake, playing with Scout on the plush rug near the fireplace. The dog, who had kept a quiet, watchful vigil all night, seemed to have transformed from a silent guardian into a joyful playmate. He knows tricks. "Mommy?" Henry exclaimed, his voice bright with excitement, all traces of the previous night's fear and cold gone. "Show her, Scout." At Henry's command, Scout sat, offered a paw, then rolled over with an almost human sense of showmanship, his tail thumping against the floor. "He's very smart," Margaret agreed, smiling, the sound of their laughter like medicine for her weary soul. After yesterday's trauma, seeing them so happy, so completely in the moment with the dog, was a profound relief. They dressed in the assortment of clothes George had left outside their door, clearly belongings of the missing Walter Hayes, tailored for a taller man, but clean and well-made. When they ventured downstairs, they found the kitchen empty, but a note on the counter, simply stating, "Help yourselves." "Gone to check generator." "Al, I'm starving," Clara announced dramatically, rubbing her stomach. "Me too," Henry chimed in. "Can we have pancakes?" The simple domesticity of making breakfast in the grand, silent kitchen felt surreal after their near-death experience, like stepping into a dream, but Margaret embraced it, grateful for this moment of normalcy, of warmth and safety. Scout sat patiently nearby as she cooked, accepting the occasional morsel with gentlemanly restraint. As they ate, Margaret noticed her children's attention repeatedly drawn to the windows, where the storm continued its assault, though with less ferocity than the previous night. "When can we go exploring?" Henry asked around a mouthful of syrupy pancake, eager to discover the secrets of the vast house. "We're guests here, not tourists," Margaret reminded him gently. "We should stay in the areas Mr. Thompson showed us." "But Scout wants to show us something," Clara insisted, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He keeps going to the door and coming back." Margaret glanced at the golden retriever. Indeed. Scout was standing by the kitchen door, looking back at them with an expectant, almost urging expression. After breakfast, she compromised. "Okay," she said. "We can take a little look around the first floor, but we stay together. All right?" The moment the dishes were cleared, Scout led their small procession through the mansion's ground floor. Margaret couldn't help but marvel at the place. Every room was a testament to refined taste and old money, a quiet display of a life lived fully and graciously. From the library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with volumes that looked both well-read and perfectly preserved, to the music room housing a grand piano and glass-cased antique instruments, the house exuded a sense of history and quiet elegance. Scout moved with purpose, not just wandering aimlessly, but following a specific path. He occasionally paused, looking back to ensure they were following, his tail giving an impatient little thump against the floor as if to say, "Hurry up! This way." He led them eventually to a wood-paneled study, a room dominated by a massive desk and more portraits of Walter Hayes at various ages. One photograph showed him receiving some kind of humanitarian award. Another depicted him breaking ground at a construction site. He wasn't just a man of wealth, he was a man of action, a builder, a philanthropist. He built things, Clara observed, studying the photos with interest. "Looks like he built a lot of things." Margaret agreed, noting the plaques commemorating hospitals, schools, and housing developments that were visible in some of the pictures. Walter Hayes was clearly a man who had made his mark on the world. Scout padded to a specific section of the bookshelf and sat down, looking up at it, then back at them, tail wagging expectantly. "What is it, boy?" Henry asked, approaching the shelf. Margaret joined him, examining the books. Nothing seemed unusual at first. The spines were all neatly aligned, the titles mostly classics or weighty nonfiction, until she noticed it, a gap, a space on the shelf where a book had clearly been removed. Scout pawed at the empty space, whining softly, looking from the gap to Margaret, then back to the gap. "Something's missing?" Margaret murmured, her curiosity piqued. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Scout wasn't just showing them the room. He was showing them this specific spot, this specific missing item. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them all turn. George Thompson stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. Margaret and the children by the bookshelf, Scout sitting attentively beside them. "I see you've met the tour guide," he said dryly, nodding toward Scout. "We were just—" Margaret began apologetically, feeling a flush of embarrassment at being caught exploring. George waved off her explanation. "It's fine. Scout has his routines. This was Walter's favorite room." "He seems like he was an interesting man," Margaret ventured, gesturing to the photographs on the wall. "He was," George confirmed, a genuine, albeit fleeting, fondness creeping into his usually guarded tone. "Brilliant mind, self-made billionaire who never forgot where he came from. Used his fortune to help people who reminded him of himself as a young man." "How did you know him?" Clara asked boldly, cutting straight to the heart of the matter with a child's directness. George hesitated, as if debating how much to share. "We met during a case years ago. He was a witness. We stayed in touch." "What's missing from the bookshelf?" Margaret asked, nodding towards the gap Scout had identified, deciding to push gently. Something flickered in George's eyes, recognition, then weariness. "Just an old journal," he said dismissively. "Nothing important." The lie was obvious. The swift dismissal, the guarded look, Scout's insistent focus on the spot. It was clearly something important, but Margaret chose not to call him on it, not yet. Instead, she changed the subject again. "How's the storm looking?" "Tapering off finally," George replied, seeming relieved to move on. "Roads should be clear by tomorrow morning, as I thought. I've called for a tow truck to retrieve your car." "That's very kind of you," Margaret said, genuinely touched by the consideration. George looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. "It's nothing. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check the east wing. Lost power there overnight." After he'd gone, Clara turned to Margaret with the unfiltered honesty of childhood. "He's sad," she declared, "and he's hiding something." "Everyone has secrets, honey," Margaret reminded her, though she couldn't disagree with her daughter's assessment of George. "I think Scout wants us to find out what," Henry said, watching the dog, who was still sitting patiently by the bookshelf with the missing volume, his gaze fixed on the empty space. "Well, we're not going to snoop," Margaret said firmly, stating the principle even as her own curiosity gnawed at her. "Mr. Thompson has been kind enough to give us shelter. We're not going to repay that by prying into his private affairs." Even as she said it, though, Margaret couldn't deny her own intrigue. There was clearly much more to George Thompson and this magnificent isolated mansion than met the eye, and somehow the mysterious Scout seemed determined to uncover it. The mini-climax of this section wasn't just finding the gap on the shelf, but the dawning, certain knowledge that Scout's purpose here was far greater than simply leading them to shelter. A dog's persistent nudge, a hidden journal, and a truth buried beneath the snow. It all pointed to something significant, something the mansion was keeping secret. The rest of the day passed quietly. George remained mostly absent, appearing only briefly to check if they needed anything before disappearing again to some other part of the vast house. Scout stayed with them constantly, his warm, calm presence a comfort that made the grand mansion feel less intimidating, less empty. That evening, as Margaret tucked Clara and Henry into the large, comfortable beds, Clara voiced the question that had clearly been building all day. "Mommy, why does Scout want us to find that missing book so badly?" Margaret smoothed her daughter's hair, hesitating. How much could she explain? "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe he just misses his owner." "I think it's more than that," Clara insisted with a child's unwavering conviction. "I think he's trying to tell us something important." "Well, whatever it is, it will have to wait until morning," Margaret said, kissing her forehead. "Time for sleep now." Once the children were asleep, their breathing soft and even in the quiet room, Margaret found herself drawn downstairs again. The grand house was eerily silent at night, moonlight streaming through the tall windows to cast elongated, dancing shadows across the antique furnishings. The wind outside had lessened, a low murmur now, But the silence within the house felt profound, as if the very walls held their breath, guarding secrets. She hadn't intended to return to the study, but her feet carried her there nonetheless. She told herself she was just stretching her legs, fighting off the restlessness that came with being stranded in a strange, mysterious place. But deep down, she knew she was drawn back to the gap on the bookshelf, to the mystery Scout had highlighted. The study door was ajar, a sliver of warm light indicating it wasn't empty. Margaret hesitated, not wanting to intrude if George was inside. She was about to turn away when she heard his voice, low, rough, and filled with an emotion she couldn't immediately identify. Grief, yes, but something else, too. Pain and apology. "I know what you're doing," he was saying, his voice thick with emotion, "but it won't bring them back. Nothing will. Curiosity, a powerful force, overrode propriety." Margaret peered through the narrow opening. George sat at the massive desk, a glass of whiskey at his elbow, addressing Scout, who sat attentively before him, head tilted, ears slightly perked. "5 years?" George continued, his voice breaking slightly. "And you're still trying to fix what can't be fixed. Why can't you understand? It's too late." Scout whined softly, a low sound of canine sympathy, placing a golden paw gently on George's knee. "I know, boy. I miss them, too." The raw grief in George's voice made Margaret's chest tight. She must have made some small sound, a quiet intake of breath, for suddenly George's head snapped up, his eyes finding hers in the gap of the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, embarrassed at being caught eavesdropping on such a private, vulnerable moment. "I was just walking and saw the light." George's expression closed off instantly, the vulnerability she'd witnessed vanishing behind his customary reserve. "It's late," he said, his voice returning to its gruff tone. "You should be resting." "Who are you talking about?" Margaret asked gently, stepping into the room despite his obvious desire for solitude. When you said them, for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would shut down completely. Then, something in him seemed to deflate, a weary resignation washing over his features. "My family," he said quietly, the words heavy with sorrow. "My wife, Beverly, our daughter, Susan. They died 5 years ago." "I'm so sorry," Margaret said, meaning it with all her heart, having just narrowly escaped death with her own children. The weight of his loss felt particularly heavy. Was it an accident? George's laugh held no humor, only a bitter, painful sound. That would have been easier to accept. No, it wasn't an accident. They were murdered. The blunt statement hung in the air between them, stark and terrible. The warmth of the room seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sudden, chilling cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside, the case that brought me into Walter's orbit. George continued after a moment, his voice distant now, recounting events from a lifetime ago. Was investigating a crime syndicate. They were laundering money through construction projects. He paused, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. Walter was developing properties in the same area. He noticed irregularities, inconsistencies in the financials. He came forward as a witness. George's knuckles whitened around his glass. His testimony was crucial. It put away several high-level operators. But one got away. The ringleader, a man named Silas Black. A tense silence followed, the name hanging in the air like a threat. Mercer swore vengeance. George continued, his voice low and rough, filled with a pain that was still raw. 5 years later. On everyone involved in the case. He broke off, unable to complete the sentence, the memory too painful to articulate. "That's when Walter disappeared," Margaret said softly, making the connection, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying clarity. George nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. The official theory was that Mercer got to him, too. Another loose end tied up. But nobody was ever found. Not Walter. Not his body. "And you came here?" Margaret asked, trying to understand the path that had led the Metro City detective to this isolated mansion. "Why after it happened?" George said, his gaze fixed on some point in the distance, reliving the nightmare. "I was not well. Consumed with finding Mercer. Obsessed. Nearly destroyed myself in the process. He looked back at Margaret. Walter had left instructions. If anything happened to him, I was to be given access to this property. A ghost of a smile, fleeting and sad, touched his lips again. His lawyers contacted me. Richard always did have an uncanny ability to anticipate others' needs. So, you've been living here ever since, Margaret said, putting the pieces together, hiding from the world. Not hiding, George corrected sharply, his detective's edge returning for a moment, waiting for what Margaret asked, her eyes meeting his. The intensity in them was startling, a fierce, burning light in the shadows of his grief, for answers, for justice, for whatever comes first. Scout moved to stand between them, looking from one to the other, his tail giving a slow, gentle wag, as if following their conversation, understanding the weight of the words. The dog's intelligent gaze made Margaret wonder, not for the first time, if he understood far more than an animal should. And Scout, she asked, returning to the question that had first drawn her into this mystery. He was Walter's dog, but he stays with you. As I said, he comes and goes. George replied, his expression softening as he looked down at the golden retriever. Sometimes disappears for weeks, but he always returns. He reached down and gently scratched Scout behind the ears. Walter called him his conscience, said Scout could sense goodness in people. Always knew who needed help. He certainly knew we needed help last night. Margaret agreed, a wave of warmth washing over her as she thought of their rescue from the cave. Yes, George said, studying her with renewed interest, a thoughtful look in his eyes. He's never brought anyone quite like you before. What do you mean? The others were travelers, hikers, people passing through, he explained, needing a warm place for the night, not a mother with young children starting a new life. George's perception was unnervingly accurate, cutting straight to the core of her situation. It makes me wonder what Scout thinks you need to be here for. The question lingered between them, unanswered, but heavy with implication. Outside, the storm continued to rage, though with diminishing fury. A perfect metaphor, Margaret thought, for the emotional tempest contained within the mansion's walls. The mini-climax of this conversation wasn't just learning about George's tragic past and his connection to Walter Hayes, but the dawning realization that their arrival, guided by Scout, might be part of a larger, unseen design. Walter Hayes didn't die. She suddenly suspected, with a jolt that went through her like electricity. He disappeared intentionally, to protect George, to fight Silas Black. And somehow, Scout was at the center of it all, still working towards some unknown goal, even after 5 long years. Dawn broke over the mountains, bringing with it a transformed landscape. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that sparkled under clear, pale blue skies. Margaret stood at the bedroom window, watching the sun rise, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of pink and gold. A cautious hope built within her. If the roads were cleared as George predicted, they could resume their journey to Harmony Creek by afternoon. Yet, as she gazed out at the breathtaking, silent vista, she felt an unexpected reluctance. There was something unfinished here, a mystery surrounding George, Walter Hayes, and the remarkably intuitive Scout that tugged at her curiosity. A story half told. "Mommy, can we go outside and play in the snow?" Henry asked, joining her at the window, his face pressed against the cool glass. "Please," Clara added, bouncing on the balls of her feet. "It looks so perfect after breakfast." Margaret agreed. The storm was over. The immediate danger passed. The children deserved a chance to experience the wonder of this fresh, deep snow. "But stay where I can see you from the house," she cautioned, "and don't go too far." The children cheered, their excitement infectious. Even Scout, curled at the foot of Henry's bed, perked up his ears and wagged his tail at the prospect of playing in the snow. When they made their way downstairs, they found George in the kitchen, already dressed in heavy outdoor clothing, zipping up a sturdy winter jacket. There was a backpack by his feet. "Going somewhere?" Margaret asked, noting his preparations. "Need to check the road conditions," he replied, his voice back to its usual gruffness after the previous night's vulnerability. "And clear the driveway enough for the tow truck to get through." There's coffee made. Thank you, Margaret said. The kids want to play outside after breakfast. Is that okay? George nodded. The storm's passed. Should be safe enough now. He hesitated, then added, try to keep them on the west side of the house. Better visibility from the kitchen windows. We will, Margaret promised, touched by his concern despite his gruff demeanor. As George prepared to leave, Scout approached him, nosing at his backpack, a silent question passing between them. George patted the dog's head. Not this time. Boy, stay with them. Scout obediently retreated to sit beside Henry, who immediately threw an arm around the dog's neck in a half hug. He really listens to you, Margaret observed, surprised by the dog's compliance. He listens to everyone, George corrected, his expression unreadable. He just chooses when to obey. After a simple breakfast, Margaret bundled the children in layers of their own clothes, topped with some smaller items she'd found in a hallway closet, likely belonging to visitors from years past. They tumbled out into the snow with unbridled joy, Scout bounding alongside them, a golden streak against the white. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Clara and Henry built a lopsided snowman, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. Scout participated enthusiastically, rolling in the snow, chasing snowballs, and occasionally bringing them sticks for the snowman's arms. It was during one such retrieval that something unusual happened. Instead of returning with a simple stick, Scout emerged from around the corner of the house with what appeared to be a weathered leather notebook held carefully in his mouth. Margaret's interest, already piqued by the mystery of the missing journal, surged. She watched as Scout delivered his find to Clara, who examined it with visible excitement before showing it to Henry. Both children then looked towards the house, clearly searching for her. Within moments, they were bursting through the back door, faces flushed with cold and discovery. Mommy, look what Scout found. Clara thrust the item forward, a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen slightly from moisture, but largely intact. Where did he find this? Margaret asked, accepting the journal cautiously. Behind some bushes near the east side of the house, Henry explained, puffing slightly. It was kinda buried in the snow, but Scout dug it up. Is it the missing book from the shelf? Clara asked eagerly, her eyes wide with anticipation. Margaret examined the journal, noting with growing certainty that it was indeed the volume Scout had been so interested in the day before. The size, the weathered leather binding, it matched the other books on Walter Hayes's shelf, and the faded gold monogram on the cover, RK, confirmed its ownership. Richard Kensington, Walter Hayes, the same man. I think it might be, she confirmed, feeling a mixture of curiosity and unease. But if this was hidden outside, it means someone deliberately took it from the library and concealed it. Maybe Mr. Thompson Henry suggested, his voice a whisper. Or maybe Walter Hayes himself, Clara countered, before he disappeared. Either way, Margaret said firmly, making a decision. This belongs to the house. Her fingers traced the worn cover. We should put it back on the shelf where Scout indicated it was missing. Aren't you going to read it first? Clara asked, voicing the temptation Margaret herself was feeling, a powerful urge to uncover the secrets within its pages. That would be an invasion of privacy, Margaret said, trying to inject a note of firm principle into her voice, though her conviction wavered under Scout's intent gaze. The dog seemed to be urging her, pushing the journal closer with his nose. I think Scout wants you to read it, Henry observed, stating the obvious. Maybe there's something important inside. Margaret's fingers hovered over the cover. Scout had led them here. He had led them to the missing book. He had done it deliberately. Maybe, just maybe, he was trying to show them something that needed to be seen. Just a quick look, she finally conceded, making the choice that curiosity demanded, to make sure there's nothing urgent. Then, we're putting it back exactly where it belongs. It was the mini-climax of this moment, the decision to open the journal, to delve into the hidden history of the mansion and its missing owner, a choice orchestrated, it seemed, by a dog with a purpose. A dog's persistent nudge, a hidden journal, and a truth buried beneath the snow. The pieces were coming together, and Margaret was about to see the picture they formed. The journal opened stiffly, its pages crackling with the cold and the weight of years. Walter Hayes's handwriting was neat and precise. filling the pages with observations, thoughts, and occasional sketches. Margaret flipped carefully through the early entries, which detailed business meetings and personal reflections from approximately 6 years ago. They painted a picture of a sharp, insightful man, successful and respected. It wasn't until she reached the entries from 5 years ago, around the time of George's family's murder and Walter's own bewildering disappearance, that her attention was truly, chillingly caught. April 15th. She read aloud, the date stark on the page. George's world has shattered. Beverly and Susan are gone, taken by Mercer's men in the most cowardly act of vengeance. The police have no leads. George is consumed by grief and rage, a dangerous combination I know too well. I fear what he might do, how far he might go in pursuit of justice that the law cannot provide. Clara and Henry listened with wide eyes, too young to fully comprehend the tragedy, but old enough to recognize the gravity in Margaret's voice. Margaret continued reading, skimming through several entries describing Walter's growing concern for George's mental state and his own increasing paranoia about Silas Black's organization. It was clear from the entries that Walter wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was deeply loyal to his friend and keenly aware of the dangerous world they were both now connected to. He was investigating Mercer himself, using his resources and network to uncover the truth. Then she found an entry that made her breath catch, a chilling premonition of the future that was now their present. May 30th. She read, her voice barely above a whisper. My sources confirm Mercer has contracted my death. George would be next. Walter knew he was a target, and he knew his friend was also in the crosshairs. I've finalized my contingency plan. Margaret paused, looking at the words on the page. A contingency plan for his own death. The only way to save us both, the entry continued, and eventually bring Mercer to justice, is this. Few will understand my choice, but it's the only path forward. Walter was planning something drastic, something that would take him out of the public eye. Arthur will hate me for it initially. I only pray that someday he'll forgive me when he understands the full scope of what I've set in motion. Arthur, George. Walter was talking about George. He knew George would believe he was dead. What does that mean? Clara asked, her brow furrowed in concentration, sensing the importance of the words even if she didn't grasp their full meaning. I'm not sure, Margaret admitted, her mind racing, turning the page with trembling fingers. The next entry, dated June 20th, was the final one in the journal. All arrangements are complete. My disappearance is scheduled for tomorrow. The evidence against Mercer is secured in the place only Scout can find. My faithful conscience and guardian. When the time is right, he'll know who to lead there. Margaret's eyes widened as she read the words. Scout. The dog. He was part of Walter's plan. The hardest part is leaving Arthur to believe another friend has been taken from him. But it's necessary for his safety. Better he mourn me than join Beverly and Susan. I've instructed my lawyers to offer him sanctuary here, where the safeguards I've installed will protect him until my work is finished. If I succeed, justice will come for Beverly and Susan. If I fail, at least Arthur will be safe from Mercer's reach. Margaret closed the journal slowly, her mind reeling with the implications, the words echoing in the quiet study. Walter Hayes didn't die, she murmured, the truth settling over her like a second skin. He disappeared intentionally. He staged his own death, to protect George, and to gather evidence against Silas Black. He had been gone for 5 years, living, where, doing what? So, where is he now? Henry asked innocently, looking up at her, the simple question cutting through the complexity of the revelation. I don't know, honey, Margaret replied, glancing at Scout, who was watching her with that same unnerving intelligence from his spot on the rug. His purpose, suddenly, was clearer. He wasn't just a stray or a guide to shelter. He was a key. But I think, she said, looking back at the journal in her hands, then at the dog, I think Scout has been trying to lead us to these answers all along. We should tell Mr. Thompson, Clara declared, eager to share the discovery. Wait, Margaret cautioned. They needed a moment to process this. This journal was 5 years old. If Walter Hayes was alive, why hadn't he contacted George? Why hadn't Mercer been brought to justice? Maybe something went wrong with his plan, Clara suggested, showing insight beyond her years. Maybe, Margaret agreed, or maybe... Her speculation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening and closing. George had returned. Scout's ears perked up, but instead of running to greet him as expected, the dog pushed the journal toward Margaret with his nose, then moved to sit in front of the door, as if standing guard. "He doesn't want Mr. Thompson to know we found it," Henry whispered, catching on quickly. "Not yet," Margaret agreed quickly, slipping the journal into the inner pocket of her borrowed sweater. The mini-climax of this section was the shocking reveal from the journal. Walter Hayes was alive, and his disappearance was a calculated move in a dangerous game, a game Scout was still playing. "Let's not mention this until we understand more." "Okay, this is grown-up business." Both children nodded solemnly, recognizing the seriousness of the situation despite their youth. A criminal empire, murder, a staged disappearance, and a dog leading them to hidden secrets. Their time in the Hayes estate had just become infinitely more complicated. George appeared in the kitchen doorway, stamping snow from his boots. "Road to the main highway is clear," he announced, his voice back to its usual clipped efficiency after his brief absence. "Tow truck will be here by noon to get your car. Should be able to have it running, or at least towed to a garage, by evening." "That's good news," Margaret replied, hoping her voice sounded normal, trying to hide the journal tucked inside her sweater. "Thank you for arranging it." George's gaze swept over them, lingering briefly on Scout, who was still sitting protectively in front of the door, before returning to Margaret's face. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem unsettled. Everything all right, just processing how quickly things are moving." Margaret improvised, searching for a plausible explanation. "Yesterday we were nearly freezing to death, and now we're planning to leave. It's a lot to take in." George nodded, seeming to accept her explanation. "Life changes quickly. Something you learn in my line of work." "Your former line of work," Margaret corrected gently. A subtle reminder of his past as a detective. A shadow crossed George's face. "Some jobs you never really leave behind." He glanced at his watch. "I need to make some calls. Make yourselves at home until the truck arrives." After he left, Clara tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "What are we going to do about the journal and Mr. Hayes' secret?" Margaret knelt to her children's level, looking into their serious faces. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. The weight of the secret felt heavy. "But I think we were meant to find this." Scout made sure of it. She glanced at the dog, who watched them with his usual quiet intensity. "Let me read more of the journal while you two play." Maybe there are more clues about what Walter was planning. While the children returned to their snowman building under the watchful eye of Scout, Margaret retreated to a window seat in the library, the journal hidden in her lap. She could supervise their play from here while immersing herself in Walter Hayes' words. The earlier entries painted a picture of a brilliant, compassionate man, deeply troubled by the corruption he had uncovered and the subsequent threat to those he cared about. His friendship with George was clearly profound. He wrote of their conversations, George's devotion to his family, and later, his devastating grief. Most intriguing were Walter's references to the evidence and the place only Scout can find. Whatever proof he had gathered against Silas Black, he had hidden it somewhere on the property, believing Scout would lead the right person to it when the time came. "Is that why you brought us here?" Margaret murmured, looking out at the golden retriever playing with her children in the snow. "Is that what you're trying to accomplish?" The sound of approaching footsteps made her quickly tuck the journal away again, slipping it back into her sweater pocket. George appeared in the library doorway, his expression tense, his posture rigid. "Is something wrong?" Margaret asked, her heart rate picking up. "The tow truck can't make it," he said. The words clipped. "Avalanche further down the mountain has closed the main access road. They're saying at least 2 days before it's cleared." "Oh," Margaret said, surprised by her own reaction. A feeling of unexpected relief rather than frustration. "Well, I hope we're not imposing too much by staying longer." George waved away her concern. "The house has plenty of space and the children—" He paused, his eyes drifting to the window where Clara and Henry were laughing, throwing snowballs for Scout. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "It's been a long time since there was young laughter here." The uncharacteristic sentiment revealed a glimpse of the man beneath the hardened exterior, a hint of the life he had lost. Margaret seized the opportunity, sensing a chance to build a connection, to offer a different kind of understanding. "George," she began carefully, "last night, you mentioned your family. I want you to know I understand something of what you're going through." She spoke of her own marriage, the slow erosion of trust, the pain of watching the man she loved become someone she no longer recognized. "It's a different kind of loss, I know, but I know how it feels when life suddenly veers off the path you expected." George's expression softened marginally, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "How long?" "The divorce was finalized last month," Margaret replied, "but the marriage died years ago." She told him about their destination, Harmony Creek. "I have a job lined up at the elementary school there, teaching second grade." "A teacher?" George nodded, as if this explained something about her, about the gentle strength he sensed. "You're good with children." "I try to be," Margaret smiled, "though my own keep me on my toes." A comfortable silence fell between them, a shared understanding of loss and unexpected detours. Their conversation was broken when Scout began barking excitedly outside. They both turned to see the dog running in circles around something in the snow. "What's he found now?" George muttered, more to himself than to Margaret, a note of weary familiarity in his voice. They watched as Clara brushed snow away from whatever Scout had discovered, revealing what appeared to be a metal handle protruding from the ground. "Is that a door?" Margaret asked, leaning closer to the window. George's posture changed instantly, tension radiating from every line of his body. The brief moment of connection vanished, replaced by guarded suspicion. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice sharp, already striding towards the hallway. "Wait, my children are out there," Margaret protested, hurrying after him, her maternal instincts kicking in. By the time they reached the back door and pulled on boots and jackets, Clara and Henry had managed to clear most of the snow from what was indeed a small, metal door set into the ground, a cellar entrance or storm shelter of some kind. "Step away from that." George called sharply as he trudged through the snow towards them. Clara looked up, startled by his tone, but Henry pointed. "But Scout wants us to open it. He keeps pawing at the handle." Sure enough, the golden retriever was intently focused on the metal door, occasionally glancing back at the approaching adults as if urging them to hurry. "It's just an old storage cellar," George said, his casual tone belied by the tension in his shoulders. "Nothing of interest down there." "Then why is Scout so excited about it?" Henry asked innocently, looking from the dog to George. George reached them, placing himself between the children and the cellar door. "Scout gets excited about squirrels, too," he said dismissively. "Doesn't mean we should dig up every hole in the yard?" Margaret caught up, slightly breathless from the cold air and the sudden rush outside. "Kids," she said, her teacher voice firm but gentle. "Why don't you go inside and warm up? You've been out for quite a while." "But Mom," Clara began to protest. "Please," Margaret said firmly, leaving no room for argument. With reluctant glances at the mysterious door, both children trudged towards the house. Scout surprisingly made no move to follow them. Instead, he remained firmly planted beside the cellar entrance, eyes fixed on George with what Margaret could only describe as challenge, a silent, unwavering insistence. The mini-climax of this section was the dramatic reveal of the hidden cellar door, clearly indicated by Scout, and George's tense reaction to it. It was the next step in the mystery, a clear sign that Scout's purpose was tied to something hidden beneath the mansion itself. Once the children were safely inside, Margaret turned to George. Scout remained planted firmly beside the cellar entrance, his eyes fixed on the man with an insistent, unwavering gaze. "What's really down there?" Margaret asked directly, cutting through the pretense. "Like I said, storage," George maintained, though his eyes never left Scout, and the tension in his body was a clear contradiction. "Old equipment, gardening tools, nothing worth getting excited about." "Then why are you lying about it?" Margaret asked, her voice calm but firm. George's head snapped toward her, surprise evident in his expression. "Excuse me." Margaret took a deep breath, deciding it was time to lay her cards on the table, to share the secret Scout had led them to. "I found Walter's journal, the one that was missing from the shelf." She watched his face, seeing the color drain from it, leaving behind the weathered lines. "A Scout dug it up from the snow while you were gone this morning." "What does that have to do with anything?" George asked, his voice low, guarded. "I think," Margaret interrupted gently, stepping closer, acknowledging the weight of the past he carried. "Richard wrote about evidence he gathered against Mercer, evidence he hid somewhere on the property that only Scout can find." She gestured towards the metal door at their feet. "And now Scout is very interested in that cellar door." George stood motionless, the internal struggle visible on his weathered face. The conflict between his duty to Walter's secrets and the dawning possibility that justice, the very thing he had been waiting for, might be within reach, played out in his eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind, a sound of deep, weary reluctance. "You don't understand what you're getting involved in." "Then help me understand," Margaret urged, stepping closer still. "Walter was your friend. He disappeared to protect you, to gather evidence that would bring justice for your family." She looked from the cellar door back to George. "Whatever is down there might be exactly what you've been waiting for these past 5 years. Or it might be nothing," George countered, though doubt had crept into his voice, weakening his resistance. "Walter's been gone for 5 years. If he had evidence against Mercer, why hasn't he used it? Why leave me here, thinking he was dead all this time?" The pain of those 5 years of believing his friend was gone, another victim of Silas Black, was etched on his face. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but I think we need to find out. Scout brought us here for a reason. George, I believe that reason is connected to whatever's behind that door." She looked at the dog, who sat patiently, watching them with that intense, knowing gaze. George stared at the cellar entrance, conflict evident in every line of his body. Then Scout whined softly, a small, encouraging sound, pressing his head against George's hand in a gesture so gentle and understanding that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. It was a powerful moment of connection between the dog and the man, a silent plea to trust, to hope. "Okay," George finally conceded, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, the word a surrender to Scout's insistence and Margaret's quiet urging. "Let's see what Walter's conscience wants us to find." He knelt in the snow and grasped the metal handle. The door resisted at first, frozen shut by years of neglect, by the weight of snow and secrets. But, with a forceful pull, it broke free, scraping against the frozen earth, revealing a narrow set of concrete steps descending into darkness. "Wait here," George instructed, reaching into his pocket for a small flashlight, his old detective instincts resurfacing. "Not a chance," Margaret replied, surprising herself with her own determination, a fierce resolve that had been rekindled by the journal's revelations. "We do this together." Something like respect flickered in George's eyes before he nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of her resolve. He led the way down the worn steps, the beam of the flashlight cutting a path through the thick, musty air. Scout trotted confidently ahead, a golden guide leading them deeper into the mansion's hidden history. The cellar was larger than Margaret had expected, a series of interconnected rooms carved into the bedrock beneath the mansion. The first room did indeed contain gardening equipment and storage, just as George had claimed, but Scout paid it no attention, moving purposefully towards a metal door at the far end. This second door was different, newer, more substantial, with an electronic keypad glowing faintly in the dim light. "I've never seen this before," George admitted, examining the lock, his detective's mind already at work. "Never knew it was here." Scout sat before the keypad, looking expectantly at George, then back at the door. "I don't know the code," George told the dog, as if expecting him to understand, a touch of weary humor in his voice. Scout barked once, then pawed at George's jacket pocket, the one where he kept his wallet. "What?" George asked, confused, but he removed his wallet nonetheless. "Try your birthday?" Margaret suggested. George shook his head. Walter wouldn't use something so obvious. But Scout continued to nose at the wallet until George opened it. From within, he extracted a faded photograph, a candid shot of George with a beautiful woman and a young girl, all laughing at something off camera. "Beverly and Susan," Margaret said softly. Recognizing the family from George's description, the faces from his grief-stricken words the night before, George stared at the photo, his expression raw with grief and love. "Walter took this picture," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "At a barbecue at his place, about 6 months before." He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence, the memory too painful. Scout whined again, pawing gently at the photograph, then at the keypad. George turned it over, revealing a series of numbers written on the back in faded ink. "It's a date," George realized, his voice filled with a dawning wonder. The date of this photo. With trembling fingers, he entered the numbers into the keypad. The lock clicked open immediately, a soft, final sound that echoed in the silent cellar. "He knew you'd keep this photo with you," Margaret said quietly, understanding the depth of Walter's foresight and friendship. "Even after all these years," George didn't reply, but the depth of emotion on his face spoke volumes, a mixture of profound sorrow, disbelief, and a fragile, hesitant hope. Pushing the heavy door open, George stepped into what appeared to be a small, meticulously organized office, a desk with a computer, filing cabinets, and a wall covered in photographs, documents, and maps connected by colored strings, a detective's investigation board. "Richard," George breathed, taking in the scene with growing astonishment. "Walter, this was his war room." Scout moved to the desk, pawing at a drawer insistently. When George opened it, he found a sealed envelope with his name written on it in Walter's distinctive handwriting. While George read the letter with shaking hands, Margaret examined the wall of evidence. It detailed an elaborate criminal network headed by Silas Black, with connections to corrupt officials, money laundering operations, and, most disturbingly, several murders, including those of Beverly and Susan Thompson. "He's been building a case," Margaret realized aloud, a sense of awe washing over her. "All these years, in secret." "Yes," George confirmed, his voice unsteady as he looked up from the letter, his eyes meeting Margaret's. "Walter didn't just disappear. He died in a way, became someone else, a ghost who could infiltrate Mercer's organization from within." "What does the letter say?" Margaret asked gently. George handed it to her wordlessly. The handwriting was hurried but clear. "Arthur," it began, using George's first name, "if you're reading this, then Scout has found someone he trusts to help you." Margaret's eyes flickered to the dog, who sat by the desk, watching them. "I'm sorry for the pain my disappearance caused, but it was the only way to keep you safe while I gathered what we needed. The evidence is all here, everything to put Mercer away for life, but I couldn't send it to the authorities while you were still vulnerable. Mercer has too many eyes in law enforcement." Margaret continued reading, her heart pounding. "By now, I've likely been dead for several years. My new identity has allowed me to document Mercer's operation from the inside. The final piece came into place last month. Walter had completed his mission. I'll be making contact soon, within days of when Scout leads you to this room. Be ready, old friend. Justice for Laura and Claire is finally within reach. Trust Scout. He knows who can be trusted better than either of us ever could. Richard." Margaret looked up from the letter, meeting George's stunned gaze. "Walter, he's coming back," she said softly, the mini-climax of the hidden room and the letter confirming the journal's hints. "After all this time, he's coming back to help you finish this." George seemed unable to process the revelation, decades of detective suspicion warring with desperate hope. The letter wasn't dated. "How long has this been here? What does he mean by soon?" As if in answer, Scout suddenly perked up his ears and bounded back toward the stairs, barking excitedly. "Someone's here," George said sharply, instantly alert, his hand going instinctively to a cabinet from which he extracted a handgun Margaret hadn't realized he possessed. "Stay behind me." We followed Scout up the cellar stairs, emerging blinking into the bright winter sunlight that, for a moment, momentarily blinded us after the dimness below. As my vision cleared, I gasped at the scene before us. A black SUV had pulled up in the driveway, stark against the white snow. Standing beside it was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, silver-haired, bearded, and notably different from the portraits inside, yet unmistakably the same person. Walter Hayes had returned, and beside him, watching the reunion about to unfold with delighted expressions, stood Clara and Henry, who had evidently been the first to greet the mansion's long-absent owner. For a moment, time seemed suspended. George stood motionless beside me, the gun now lowered at his side, staring at the man he'd believed dead for 5 long, agonizing years. Walter Hayes returned the gaze steadily, his expression a complex mixture of apology, affection, and apprehension. The tension in the air was a palpable thing, thick with unspoken history and raw emotion. Scout broke the spell. With a happy bark, he raced across the snow to greet Walter with unrestrained joy, leaping and wagging his tail, nearly knocking the man over in his enthusiasm. Walter knelt to embrace the dog, burying his face in Scout's golden fur, whispering words too soft for me to hear. It was a reunion filled with an obvious deep bond, a testament to the dog's loyalty and place in Walter's life. "You're alive," George finally said, his voice raw and disbelieving, the years of grief and certainty shattering in that single moment. Walter straightened, keeping one hand on Scout's head, his eyes still on George. "I am," he confirmed simply, his voice quiet, though there were times I wasn't certain I'd remain that way. Clara, with the uninhibited directness of childhood that often cuts through adult tension, tugged at Walter's sleeve. "Are you the man from all the pictures in the house?" A gentle smile transformed Walter's weathered features, softening the lines of his face. "I was once young lady," he replied kindly, "though I look a bit different now. Your dog saved us in the snowstorm," Henry informed him proudly, eager to share their adventure. "Did he now?" Walter replied, unsurprised, his gaze moving to me. Scout has always had excellent judgment about who needs help. His eyes, appraising but kind, met mine. "And you must be the children's mother, Margaret Miller," I confirmed, struck by the man's commanding yet gentle presence. "And no apology necessary. Your dog truly saved our lives." Walter nodded, then turned back to George, who had not moved from his position, still processing the impossible reality before him. "Arthur," Walter began, his tone softening, using George's first name, "I know you have questions, grievances. You deserve answers to both." George's jaw tightened, the pain and anger of 5 years of believing his friend was dead, finally breaking through the shock. 5 years. Rich. 5 years. I thought you were dead. "It was the only way," Walter replied, regret evident in his voice. "Mercer had informants everywhere. If anyone, even you, had known I was alive, it would have compromised everything. You let me believe I'd lost another person I cared about," George said, the accusation sharp, the wound still fresh. "After Beverly and Susan," Walter flinched visibly at the names, the pain in George's voice clearly echoing his own. "I know it's unforgivable," he said, his voice low and sincere, "but I hope when you see what I've accomplished, you'll understand why it was necessary." An awkward silence fell, broken only by Scout's happy panting as he moved between the two men, his tail wagging, as if trying to physically bridge the gap between them. I recognized the children's growing discomfort at the tension, their wide eyes flicking between George and Walter. "Kids," I said, my voice gentle, "why don't we go inside and make some hot chocolate? I'm sure Mr. Hayes and Mr. Thompson have a lot to discuss." Clara and Henry, sensing the gravity of the adult situation, agreed without protest. As they turned toward the house, Walter called after them, "If you don't mind, I'd like Scout to stay with me. It's been a long time since I've seen him properly." I nodded my understanding, guiding the children back to the mansion while casting one last glance at the two men standing in the snow. Former friends, reunited by circumstances neither could have predicted, with Scout, the silent orchestrator, between them, inside, as I heated milk on the stove. Clara peppered me with questions. "Is that really the missing billionaire? Why does he look so different in person? Why did he pretend to be dead?" "Yes, that's Mr. Hayes," I confirmed, measuring cocoa powder into mugs. "And sometimes adults have to do difficult things to protect the people they care about." I thought of my own situation, the choices I had made to keep my children safe, like how we had to leave our old house and Daddy to be safe. Mr. Hayes was trying to catch a very bad man who hurt Mr. Thompson's family, I explained, simplifying the complex truth. He had to pretend to be someone else to do that. Like a spy? Clara's eyes widened with excitement, transforming the grim reality into a childhood adventure. A bit like that, I agreed, unwilling to reveal the more disturbing aspects of Silas Black's world to them. As they sipped their hot chocolate, I positioned myself near the kitchen window, which offered a partial view of the driveway. George and Walter were still outside, deep in intense conversation, their body language slowly shifting from confrontation to something more muted, a tentative truce being established. Scout sat between them, his attention swiveling from one to the other as they spoke. Eventually, both men moved toward the house, their steps heavy, the weight of the conversation clear. The kitchen door opened, admitting a blast of cold air along with George, Walter, and Scout. The dog immediately went to Henry, resting his head on the boy's lap as if seeking comfort after the emotional encounter outside. "I believe we all have some catching up to do," Walter announced, removing his heavy coat to reveal a lean frame and simple, practical clothing that bore little resemblance to the elegant attire he wore in his portraits. "But first, I owe everyone an explanation. Clara, ever direct, spoke up. Importantly, we found your journal and the secret room under the house." Walter's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Did you now?" He cast an affectionate glance at Scout. Scout has been busy indeed. Always did have his own agenda. The journal explains some of it, George said, his tone still guarded, the pain evident beneath the surface. But not everything. "No," Walter agreed, accepting the coffee I offered with a grateful nod. "The full story is complicated. We have time," I said, glancing outside where the snow still blanketed the landscape, isolating us from the world beyond. The avalanche has us stranded for at least another day. Walter settled into a chair at the kitchen table, his posture revealing a bone-deep exhaustion that he had been concealing. "Then I'll start at the beginning," he said, though perhaps the children, I understood his concern. "Clara, Henry, why don't you two go play in the library for a while? The grown-ups need to talk about some important things." Surprisingly, both children agreed without protest, sensing the significance of the moment. Scout accompanied them, though not before casting a meaningful look at Walter that, once again, struck me as uncannily human in its understanding. The mini-climax of this section was the tense reunion between Walter and George, a moment charged with years of pain and unanswered questions, and the implicit confirmation that our presence, orchestrated by Scout, was tied to the resolution of Walter's dangerous undertaking. That night, Margaret lay awake, her mind racing with the implications of Walter's words and her own conflicted feelings. George needed someone who understood loss but hadn't been consumed by it, someone who still saw the world with hope. Could she be that person? Could this place, this impossible mansion, be a place for a new beginning, not just for her and the children, but for all of them? By the time dawn broke, painting the mountain peaks in soft light, she had reached a decision, one that surprised her with its clarity and rightness. At breakfast, she found all three of them in the kitchen, Walter cooking, George setting the table, and Scout supervising from his spot near the window, a picture of unexpected domesticity. "Good morning," Walter greeted warmly. "Sleep well." "Yes, thank you," Margaret replied, accepting a cup of coffee from George with a smile that he cautiously returned, a soft warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Clara and Henry bounded in moments later, immediately gravitating toward Scout for their morning cuddle. The dog received their attention regally, as if it were his natural due. As they ate, Walter updated them on the case against Silas Black. Overnight, federal agents had executed coordinated raids across 3 states, arresting key members of Mercer's organization. Mercer himself had been apprehended attempting to flee the country. "It's over," Walter concluded, his gaze on George. "Really over this time?" George nodded once, the significance of the moment reflected in his eyes. "Beverly and Susan can rest now," he said softly, the peace finally settling in his soul. After breakfast, Walter announced he had business to attend to, the complex process of transitioning from his undercover identity back to a new, legitimate one. Before leaving, he knelt to say goodbye to Clara and Henry, thanking them for bringing joy back to his home. "Will we see you again?" Clara asked directly. Walter smiled. I believe you will, young lady, sooner than you might think. To Margaret, he simply said, trust your instincts, with a meaningful glance toward George. After Walter's departure, George retreated to the study, presumably to process the whirlwind of revelations and emotions from the past 24 hours. Margaret took the opportunity to take the children outside, where the bright winter sunshine had begun to melt the top layer of snow into a perfect consistency for snowball fights and snow angels. Scout joined them, his golden form bounding joyfully through the drifts, occasionally pausing to check on George through the study window, as if ensuring his charge was still processing events in a healthy manner. It was mid-afternoon when George finally emerged, his expression calmer than Margaret had yet seen it. He watched the children's play for a few moments before approaching Margaret, where she sat on a garden bench, enjoying the crisp air and the sight of her happy children. Walter tells me the road should be clear by evening, he said, sitting beside her. Your car has been repaired and will be delivered here around 6. That's good news, Margaret replied, though her tone lacked conviction. George studied her profile. You don't sound particularly enthusiastic. Margaret turned to face him, deciding that directness was the only approach that made sense after everything they had experienced, after the vulnerability they had shared, after the conversation she had overheard. I've been thinking, she began carefully, about Harmony Creek, about our next steps, and George prompted, when she hesitated, his posture growing very still. The job in Harmony Creek is a good opportunity, but not a unique one, Margaret said, choosing her words carefully. With my qualifications, I could find a teaching position in many places. George's expression revealed nothing, but the stillness of his body was a clear indication of his focus. What are you saying, Margaret? I'm saying that my children feel safe here, safer than they've felt in months, she said, her voice soft but firm. I'm saying that in 3 days. This place has begun to feel more like home than anywhere we've lived recently. She took a deep breath. Taking the leap? And I'm saying that I think Scout brought us here for a reason beyond just helping you and Walter resolve your past. Walter mentioned that he's offered me a consulting position in Harmony Creek. George said slowly. I know, Margaret admitted, a faint smile touching her lips. I overheard part of your conversation last night. A genuine smile reached George's eyes, a warm crinkling at the corners. The detective and the eavesdropper. We make quite a pair. We could, Margaret agreed softly. If you wanted to try. George's gaze moved to Clara and Henry, now engaged in teaching Scout to pull them on a makeshift sled. You hardly know me, he pointed out, and I come with considerable baggage. We all have baggage, Margaret countered, thinking of her own past, her ex-husband, her lingering anxieties. Mine includes an emotionally manipulative ex-husband and trust issues that could fill a book. She reached out tentatively, placing her hand over his, the simple touch, a profound connection. But I also know that connections like the one we've formed in these past days don't happen often, that there's something worth exploring here, if you're willing. George turned his hand over, his fingers closing gently around hers. The touch was warm, steady, comforting in its simplicity. I haven't considered a future beyond justice for Beverly and Susan in 5 years, he admitted, his voice quiet, vulnerable. I'm not sure I remember how. Then we'll figure it out together, Margaret suggested, day by day. They sat in companionable silence, watching the children play with Scout in the winter sunshine. The dog, seemingly aware of the moment unfolding on the bench, glanced their way with what Margaret could have sworn was satisfaction in his intelligent eyes. Scout approves, George observed with dry humor. Scout orchestrated, Margaret corrected, smiling, according to Walter. Anyway, George's expression grew thoughtful, his fingers tightening slightly around hers. Rich always said Scout could see things we couldn't. Connections, possibilities, the goodness in people. He looked at her, his gaze soft. Maybe he saw a possibility for us before we did. I'd like to find out, Margaret said simply. In response, George raised their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles in a gesture so unexpectedly tender that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. So would I, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. From across the snowy expanse, Scout barked once, a sound of unmistakable approval that made them both laugh, breaking the intensity of the moment with welcome lightness. A new beginning, Margaret thought, watching her children's faces glow with joy and health. Not what she had planned, certainly not what she had expected when their car broke down in the blizzard, but perhaps exactly what they all needed. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the excitement had settled into a comfortable glow, George and Margaret sat on the terrace, watching the stars emerge above the mountains. Scout lay at their feet, his golden head resting contentedly on his paws. "Did you plan to propose today?" Margaret asked, admiring how the vintage ring caught the soft outdoor lighting. George chuckled. "I've had the ring for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I thought perhaps this weekend, during our picnic by the lake." He glanced down at Scout with mock accusation. Someone had other ideas. "Scout always knows best," Margaret teased, leaning against George's shoulder. "Walter swears Scout has some kind of sixth sense," George reflected, "that he sees connections and possibilities invisible to humans. After everything that's happened, I'm inclined to believe him." "I was thinking," Margaret said after a comfortable silence, "about what to tell people when they ask how we met. The truth sounds like something from a novel. Perhaps we simply say a mutual friend introduced us," George suggested, stroking Scout's golden fur with his free hand. "It's not entirely inaccurate." Margaret smiled at the understatement. "A mutual friend who saved my family from freezing to death, led us to your doorstep, helped solve a 5-year mystery, and then decided we should get married. When you put it that way, it sounds rather far-fetched," George admitted, his eyes crinkling with amusement, though Walter would argue that's exactly the kind of quiet miracle Scout has always specialized in. As if acknowledging his central role in their story, Scout raised his head, his intelligent eyes moving between them with unmistakable satisfaction before he settled back into his comfortable position. "Do you think he knew all along?" Margaret wondered. "From that first night in the storm, was he already planning this?" She gestured between them and at the mansion, now transformed into their shared home. "I've stopped questioning Scout's intentions," George replied with affectionate resignation. "But, yes, I suspect he recognized something in you, in all three of you, that I needed before I knew it myself." The spring night enveloped them in gentle darkness, the mansion's warm light spilling out onto the terrace like a beacon in the wilderness. From somewhere in the surrounding forest came the soft hooting of an owl, while inside, their children slept peacefully in rooms that had once known only silence and grief. "I never expected this," Margaret confessed softly. "When we left our old life behind, I thought the best I could hope for was safety and stability for the children. I never imagined finding a home, a partnership, a chance to build something new from the broken pieces of what came before." George finished when she trailed off. "All of that," Margaret agreed, turning her face up to his. "Thank you for letting us in that night." "Thanks, Scout," George corrected gently. "I was ready to send you right back into the storm." "Well then," Margaret amended, leaning down to stroke the dog's silky ears. "Thank you, Scout, for your extraordinary intuition and stubborn insistence." Scout thumped his tail once against the terrace floor in acknowledgement, his eyes closed in contentment. As George's arm tightened around her shoulders, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led them to this moment. A desperate flight from an unhappy past, a near-fatal encounter with nature's fury, rescue by a remarkable dog, and the discovery of a haven that had become home. Life rarely followed the paths one expected, she realized. Sometimes a wrong turn, a broken-down car, a raging storm could lead to exactly where you were meant to be all along. And sometimes it took the wisdom of a golden-hearted dog to recognize the possibilities that humans, with all their complexities and fears, might otherwise miss. Inside the mansion that had witnessed so much pain and renewal, 2 children who had known instability now slept secure in the knowledge of being cherished. Outside, beneath the vast canopy of stars, 2 adults who had experienced profound loss embraced the unexpected gift of a second chance. And between them, Scout, loyal conscience, guardian angel in canine form, kept watch, his mission beautifully, perfectly complete. Have you ever found that life's most beautiful blessings arrive in the most unexpected ways? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today. And before you go, what was your favorite moment in Scout's journey to create this new family? If this journey touched your heart, consider subscribing to hear more tales of unexpected hope and connection.